This bull saved a boy from drowning, then disappeared into the fog. Eli Mercer slipped. His boots, waterlogged and trembling on the moss-covered bank, skidded just enough to send him over. 1 second, he was peering down into the swirling brown-gray river, trying to spot what had made that distant bell chime. The next, gravity dragged him sideways, his fingers scraping air as he tumbled into the current. The cold punched the breath from his lungs. He hit the surface hard, chin first. Then the current pulled him under. Water surged into his ears, his mouth, his nose. Panic flared. He kicked, but the boots were too heavy, and the river was stronger than he imagined. It spun him like driftwood, smashing him against rocks and flinging him toward the deeper section of the Iron Root Drop, where the river made a sharp curve and the undertow turned vicious. That's where his older brother had vanished 2 years ago. No one ever found the body. His vision blurred. The fog above glowed faintly, a dirty white ceiling flickering through the waves. His arms flailed, his legs lost all feeling, and the pressure in his chest built like an explosion waiting to go off. He wanted to scream, but only bubbles came out. That was when he felt something huge beneath him. At first he thought it was a log, solid, wide. Then it moved. A sudden push lifted him upward. 2 massive shapes, horns, slid beneath his arms. A powerful body surfaced beneath him like a rising platform. He gasped and choked as his head broke the surface, the fog now just feet above, blinding and thick. The bull didn't roar or grunt or make any sound. It surged forward with fierce, steady power, cutting through the current like a black arrow. Eli's frozen fingers latched onto its back, gripping the short, bristled hair along its spine. The bull carried him toward the shallows. They reached the gravel shore beside the broken remains of the old ferry post. Wooden pilings half-sunken and rotted, forgotten by time. With a final surge, the bull shoved Eli onto the rocks. His body slid, scraped, and stopped against a mossy log. He coughed, spat water, and curled into a shivering ball, clutching his side where a jagged stone had scraped him. For a moment, the world was silent, just the whistle of the wind in the trees and the hiss of the river behind him. Then he looked up. The bull stood just feet away, steam rising from its flared nostrils, eyes glowing faintly amber in the mist. It was enormous, easily over 6 feet at the shoulder, its coat midnight black and soaked, rippling with muscle. One of its horns had a slight curve, and a white scar slashed above its right eye. A distinct black patch shaped like a crooked lightning bolt ran across its chest. Eli's breath caught. "Wait," he rasped, voice cracking. "Don't go." The bull stared at him. For a strange moment, Eli felt like it understood, like it knew. Then it stepped backward into the fog. 1 step, then another, until only its eyes were visible, and then not even that. The mist swallowed it whole. By the time the search party found Eli, hours had passed. Jonah Mercer was the first to reach him, riding his chestnut horse along the southern ridge when he spotted a splash of blue, his son's soaked jacket, near the ferry remains. "Eli!" Jonah jumped off the saddle and sprinted down the bank. His boots skidded through the gravel, hands gripping Eli's shoulders. "Eli, look at me! Look at me!" Eli blinked. "Dad!" His voice was hoarse, lips cracked. "He saved me." Jonah pulled him close, wrapping him in his coat, relief washing over him like a flood. Who? Who saved you, son?" "The bull." Eli's eyes stayed fixed on the foggy river behind them. "The bull saved me." Jonah froze. He looked out at the water, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. "Bull?" he repeated slowly, carefully. Eli nodded. "Big, black, with a lightning shape on his chest. He pulled me out, carried me." He spoke in bursts, still shaking. He looked right at me, Dad." Jonah didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the river as if expecting something, anything, to emerge from the mist again. But the bank was quiet, the fog thick, the silence growing heavy. Back at home, while the medic checked Eli's ribs and cleaned the cuts on his arms, the other ranchers shook their heads. "There haven't been bulls in the valley for years," one of them muttered over a cup of black coffee in the kitchen. "Not since the McAllister collapse." Jonah stood near the window, watching the fog roll over the southern hills like smoke. He said nothing. The ranchers didn't know what he remembered, They didn't know what he'd seen. Years ago, he couldn't have been more than 13. He'd nearly drowned in the same river bend. Same time of year, same choking current. And just when the cold had numbed his fingers, just when the darkness started pulling at the edges of his mind, something massive had lifted him. He had told himself afterward it must have been a rock or a log or even a lucky shift in the current. But that wasn't true. He had seen the horns, the scar, the black coat. He had seen Monarch. That was the name burned into his memory. The McAllister prize bull. The one everyone claimed drowned when the dam broke and the flood wiped out the herds. The one people whispered about in town, in hushed tones around campfires. Some said disease, some said starvation. A few claimed the flood took everything. But Jonah remembered what Otis Bray, the old ranch hand, once told him when he was still a boy helping shovel hay at the McAllister barns. "That bull ain't normal," Otis had said, leaning on his pitchfork. "Monarch don't just guard cattle. He guards something else, something older." Jonah hadn't understood then. Maybe he still didn't. But looking at his son now, alive when he should have been gone, shaking with cold and whispering about a bull that shouldn't exist, Jonah felt the old memory claw its way back to the surface. He knelt beside Eli and placed a hand on his back, steadying his voice. "You're sure, son?" Eli nodded. "He had a scar on his eye," he whispered. "Like a slice and a mark here." He pointed at his own chest. "It looked like lightning. He was watching me, like he knew me." Jonah swallowed hard. He'd seen that scar too. He'd never told anyone. And now 2 drownings, 2 saves, 15 years apart, and the same bull. Monarch wasn't just alive. He was still guarding that river. But guarding what? As night fell over Kestrin Valley, the fog grew thicker, swirling along the water like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a deep, low bellow echoed once, then vanished. Jonah didn't sleep that night, because no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, one thought wouldn't let him go. "The bull saved me." "You don't believe me, do you?" Eli's voice broke the quiet as he sat on the edge of the porch, his bare feet dangling off the step, his soaked jeans still stained from the riverbank. His eyes were fixed on the gravel driveway, but his fingers kept tracing the same pattern on his knee, a jagged shape like lightning, drawn with a stick of charcoal. Jonah leaned against the porch post beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't answer right away. The morning fog hadn't lifted, and the chill in the air hadn't eased, despite the sun climbing somewhere behind the clouds. "I never said I didn't believe you," Jonah replied quietly. "But you're thinking it," Eli said, glancing up at him. "Everyone is." Jonah exhaled through his nose. He had spent the last 3 nights replaying every word Eli said about the bull, about the scar above its right eye, the notch in the left horn, the black patch shaped like a lightning bolt across its chest. Every detail matched what Jonah remembered from his own past, except one thing. Monarch should have been long dead. Still, Eli was too specific, too certain, and something about the boy's gaze, sharp, insistent, haunted, made it impossible to dismiss. Jonah pushed away from the post and turned toward the barn. "I need to see someone." "Who?" Eli asked. "An old friend." Jonah didn't wait for more questions. He saddled up the truck and drove out past the edge of town where the road turned to dust and the map forgot to keep track. The trailer he was looking for hadn't moved in years. The windows were cracked, the satellite dish crooked, and the porch steps leaned hard to one side. Otis Bray was still alive, though no one saw him anymore. He'd been the last man standing when the McAllister ranch collapsed, last to leave, last to talk about it. Jonah hadn't spoken to him since he was 17. He knocked once. The door creaked open halfway. Otis stood in the shadows, grizzled and stooped, his eyes sharp under his wiry gray brows. "Jonah Mercer," he said, voice rough like dry bark. "You're late by 15 years." "I saw him," Jonah said flatly. Otis didn't blink. "You saw what?" Jonah stepped forward. "Monarch." Otis opened the door all the way. The inside of the trailer smelled like dust, oil, and old leather. Tools hung on hooks. Yellowed photographs lined the shelf above the window. Otis poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat across from Jonah, both men silent until the steam began to fade. You saw him again, didn't you? Otis finally asked, not as a question but as a confirmation. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. I knew he was still out there. That bull was always different. He pulled Eli from the river, Jonah said, his voice low. Saved him. Same spot he pulled me from when I was a boy. Otis nodded slowly. The night the dam broke, he didn't run like the others. Stayed behind. Some say he was trapped. I say he was guarding something. Or someone. He reached under the table and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased, sun-warped, edges curling. Jonah stared at it. A younger version of himself stood beside Monarch, hand resting between the bull's horns, smiling at the camera. But in the background, partially hidden behind a wooden beam, was another boy, barefoot, dark-haired, head tilted as if mid-laugh. Thomas. Jonah's throat tightened. He was there that day, Otis murmured. You and him both. I remember. They said he drowned. No body, Otis said. Just gone. The photograph shook in Jonah's hand. The timeline, the sightings, the rescue. It was all lining up, but it made no sense. If Monarch had survived the flood and gone into hiding, what had he been doing all these years? What had he been protecting? Back at the ranch, Jonah sat in the barn that night long after Eli had gone to sleep. The map of the valley was spread across the work table, littered with markers and old notes. He traced the river's course with his finger, remembering the exact location of the flood, the dam's collapse, the place where Monarch was last seen. That area had remained sealed off for years, classified as unstable. But a recent drought had lowered the river levels. A surveyor's report from 2 months ago had shown something unexpected beneath the silt. A wide, unnatural depression. Not a cave, not a barn, a hollow space. Jonah's mind raced. If the McAllister barn had been swept underground, could Thomas, have survived down there? There was only one way to know. Jonah packed rope, lanterns, waterproof boots, and a thermal blanket. He planned to go alone, but Eli was already waiting by the fence when he approached the truck. You're not leaving me again, Eli said. You need to stay. He saved me. I'm going. You can't stop me. Jonah looked at his son and saw something fierce in his eyes, something he recognized, the same stubbornness that once burned in Thomas. He hesitated, then handed Eli a flashlight. Stay close. Don't wander. Understand? The two of them followed the river trail under the cover of night. The fog curled thick around their boots. Crickets fell silent as they passed. The lantern Jonah carried cast long shadows against the reeds. They moved past the old ferry remains and followed the waterline south, where the land dipped into a crescent of stone and moss. Then they saw it, a gaping hole in the earth, the mouth of a cavern, newly exposed where the waterline had receded. Damp stone lined its edges, slick with moss. The air that came out was warm, heavy with decay, and blocking the entrance, his horns just catching the moonlight, stood Monarch. Eli's breath caught. He stepped forward, whispering, It's him. The bull didn't charge, didn't move. His body was still, but his eyes followed their every step. Jonah slowly raised his hand. We don't mean harm. Monarch snorted once, low and deep. Then he stepped aside, as if giving permission. Jonah looked at his son, then back at the dark tunnel yawning before them. He lit the lantern and stepped inside. And what they found wasn't a barn. It was a cavern, revealed by the receding waterline and guarded by fog and Monarch. Monarch turned, and the darkness swallowed him. Jonah tightened his grip on the lantern and stepped into the cave's mouth without a word. The narrow entrance forced him to duck as his boots scraped across loose stones slick with moisture. Eli followed close behind, his breath shallow, his small hand clenched around the flashlight, casting a shaky beam along the limestone walls. The cavern opened wider after a few paces, stretching into an unexpected chamber far larger than either of them had imagined. The ceiling arched high above like the inside of a cathedral, its stone ribs laced with moss and age. Water dripped steadily from the stalactites above, the only sound apart from their careful footsteps. The air was warm, humid, and stale with a damp, earthy musk. But beneath all that was another smell, faint, metallic, and human. Monarch waited several yards ahead, his massive form standing still in the dim lantern light. Jonah noticed again how the bull's stance wasn't defensive. It was hesitant. He shifted once, then again, as though unsure whether to continue. Then, with a low grunt, Monarch moved deeper into the cavern. "He wants us to follow him," Eli whispered. Jonah didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Monarch, but his mind had already sprinted ahead. Every instinct told him this was more than a discovery. It was a reckoning. They passed markings along the walls, charcoal and soot drawings, mostly brands from the old ranch. McAllister's original seal, a stylized M inside a horseshoe, and strange older glyphs no rancher would have bothered with. Jonah's lantern flickered against them, but he barely noticed. His chest tightened with every step. Then Monarch stopped. Jonah took one more stride and froze. A rusted lantern, still faintly glowing from a candle stub inside, rested on a flat stone shelf. Beside it, half in shadow, sat a figure, legs drawn to his chest, arms wrapped in ragged, filthy sleeves, beard long and tangled. His face, sunken and pale, turned toward the light. His eyes narrowed from the glare. Jonah's knees buckled. "Tom?" The figure blinked slowly. The voice seemed to stir something inside him. His cracked lips parted, barely moving. Monarch let out a low huff and stepped forward, lowering his head toward the man on the ground. The man reached out and placed his hand on the bull's forehead. Jonah dropped the lantern and rushed forward. "Tom, it's me. It's Jonah. Do you hear me?" Thomas's eyes darted toward the voice. Confusion passed across his face like clouds over the moon. But then, recognition, faint, fragile. His mouth trembled. "Jonah?" The name was brittle, croaked out through a throat dry from years of silence. "How?" Jonah knelt beside him, gently placing his hands on Thomas's shoulders. "You're alive. You're alive, Tom." Thomas leaned against the wall, his limbs shaking, barely able to hold himself up. I thought everyone was gone." Eli stepped closer, his mouth open in stunned awe. "Is that—" Jonah turned to him, voice tight with emotion. "This is your uncle, Eli." Eli stared at the man who looked like a ghost wearing the shape of someone once young. His voice was barely a whisper. "But they said he drowned." "I did," Thomas rasped. "Or I should have." The story unraveled slowly, between pauses and gulps of water from the flask Jonah handed him. On the day of the flood, Thomas had been near the southern silo when the dam gave way. He tried to run but was caught in the collapse. He fell through a drainage shaft that had burst open, washing him into the cavern's lowest pocket, injured, bleeding, alone, until Monarch found him. The bull had somehow made his way inside through a collapsed passage. He stayed, day after day, week after week. Monarch foraged for roots and bark. He dug fish from shallow springs. He stood guard at the entrance, watching for danger, or perhaps waiting. Thomas had survived because Monarch refused to leave. Time in the cavern was a blur to Thomas. Seasons were marked only by temperature and the strength of the light that filtered in through cracks in the stone. Hope died early, he admitted, but Monarch's presence became his anchor. Without him, he wouldn't have lasted a month. Jonah listened, his hand gripping Thomas's shoulder, his jaw trembling. "We thought you were gone," Jonah said. "I buried that day in my bones." "I tried to scream," Thomas said. "I tried to climb out once, but the rock gave way. After that, I stopped trying." He didn't. Thomas leaned against Monarch's neck, and the bull stood as still as stone. But that moment of quiet cracked when a low rumble shook through the floor beneath them. Jonah stood, instantly alert. What was that? The ceiling creaked. A series of small stones tumbled from the far wall, bouncing and echoing through the chamber. "The floodwater's been holding this place together," Jonah said, his voice quickening. "Now that it's dropped, the structure's failing." Thomas tried to rise, but his legs buckled. Jonah caught him. "We have to move. Now!" Jonah tore off his jacket and tied it into a makeshift sling around Thomas's shoulders. He grabbed spare rope from his bag, anchored it under Thomas's arms, and fastened it around his own chest. "Eli, light the way. We've got one shot." The path back narrowed fast. The walls groaned as if the cavern itself were struggling to hold its weight. Dust rained from the ceiling in thin streams. Monarch led the way, his hooves moving with steady rhythm, never panicked, but watchful. Rocks crashed behind them as they crossed a narrow ledge. Jonah's feet slipped twice, catching only by instinct. Eli pointed the flashlight ahead, voice trembling. "There's the exit!" They moved faster. The groaning turned to grinding. The ceiling above the entrance cracked down the middle, a hairline fracture that widened with each breath. Jonah turned his body to shield Thomas as they crossed beneath it. Then the rumble became a roar. "Go!" Jonah shouted. But Monarch didn't move forward. He turned instead. The bull looked at the collapsing ceiling, then at Jonah, then at Eli. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The air went still. Time seemed to stretch. Monarch's eyes locked onto Eli's. Then he charged. With a thunderous bellow, Monarch leapt forward and slammed his shoulder into the crumbling rock. The stone shuddered. He pressed against the fault line, holding it up with the weight of his body. Jonah dragged Thomas clear. Eli screamed, "No! He's holding it! Dad, he's—" "Don't look back!" Jonah bellowed. They stumbled out of the cavern mouth, gasping in the cold night air, and then a thunderous crack. A blast of dust and rock exploded from behind them as the entrance caved in. Stones rolled, collapsed, and sealed the opening shut like the earth itself had decided to bury its secret forever. Jonah and Eli turned, coughing, shielding Thomas between them. But the bull was gone. Only the rising fog remained. Man found alive after 15 years in Kestrel flood caverns. Rancher's brother rescued from collapse, saved by mysterious bull. Mercer family's miracle or mistaken identity. The story rippled out from the valley like the current that once swept Thomas away. Reporters rolled into town. Microphones were thrust forward, questions fired with impatience. But neither Jonah nor Thomas gave interviews. And Eli, still only 12, just stared past the cameras, eyes drawn to the fog on the horizon. Most dismissed the part about the bull, a delusion, they said, a side effect of trauma, an animal that never existed. But others, the ranchers, the old men who once worked for the McAllisters, and a handful of townfolk who remembered strange things whispered during heavy rains, believed, quietly, firmly. Thomas was recovering, though his body bore the weight of time spent underground. His skin was pale and papery, fingers bony, knees trembling even when seated. For the first few weeks, he slept in the darkest room in Jonah's house. Lights were too harsh. Voices made him flinch. His appetite came and went, but he was alive. And slowly, day by day, the life in him returned. Sometimes, during quiet mornings, Thomas would sit by the fireplace and speak, not always to someone, but sometimes just aloud. "He had patterns," Thomas murmured once. "Monarch, that's what you called him, right?" He didn't wait for confirmation. He knew when I was getting sick. He'd push me toward the warm side of the cavern. If I was cold, he'd lie near me. If I was drifting, he'd nudge me awake. Jonah listened from the kitchen doorway, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Thomas's voice lowered, steady now. "He wasn't just an animal. He was watching over something. Maybe us. Maybe more." Jonah didn't reply. But later that evening he pulled out the old photograph Otis had given him, the one with Thomas barely visible behind the frame. He placed it on the mantel beside a worn horseshoe and a tin box of Monarch's original branding files. Then he sat with his brother in the silence and didn't speak again for hours. Eli spent most of his time by the river. He said it helped him sleep. Some evenings, Jonah would find him crouched near the fog line, eyes straining through the mist as if hoping for a silhouette to rise from it. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the collapse, Eli came running home, breathless, cheeks flushed. "I saw him," he gasped. "I saw Monarch." Jonah turned from the fence he was repairing. "Where?" "Down by the ferry post, just past the bend. He was standing near the water." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure?" Eli nodded hard. He had the lightning mark, same horn shape, same eyes. Jonah stood still for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "What did he do?" Eli's voice softened. He looked at me, just stood there, then walked back into the fog. Jonah didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled. A rancher on the East Hill claimed to have seen hoofprints near his orchard. A delivery driver reported a dark shape crossing the road before dawn. A teenager snapped a blurry photo near Old Creek, but it was written off as a trick of light. Still, Jonah knew. So did Eli. And Thomas most of all. The town council, after much debate and hushed discussion, voted to commission a memorial. Not for Thomas, not even for the rescue itself, but for Monarch. The statue took 6 months to finish. Solid black stone, cut from mountain granite, eyes carved with precision, forward-facing and proud. The stance was powerful, horns raised slightly, one hoof braced, as if caught mid-guard. It was placed outside the Kestrin Town Hall, under the oak tree where people gathered during storms. Men who passed by tipped their hats. Boys paused and stared. And on the base, carved into a single brass plate, were the words, "For the one who remembered what we forgot, loyalty, sacrifice, and the strength to stand guard even when no one believes." Years passed. Thomas learned how to live again. He stayed in the valley, helping with the cattle when his legs allowed. He never sought the world he missed. Too much time had passed. But he kept a journal now, scribbling stories and thoughts, many about Monarch, others about the silence of stone, the taste of cave water, and the feel of being alive when no one knew it. Jonah, too, changed. He didn't speak of the past much, but he watched over both Thomas and Eli with a quiet, guarded love. He rarely ventured far from the river now. Often he'd ride out to the ridge above the bend and sit, hat tipped low, just watching. But Eli, he grew. He turned 13, then 16, then 20. He went to school in Darren City, then to university in Renslow, where he studied conservation biology. His professors often said he had a strange intensity, like he wasn't just learning facts, but trying to remember something lost. He spoke at conferences, started projects, launched campaigns to protect endangered species and preserve wild habitats. But he never mentioned Kestrin Valley, not directly. He didn't tell them about the flood, or the bull, or the night the earth swallowed the only witness to a miracle. But always, in his coat pocket, he carried a small, worn object. No one ever saw it but him. A broken horn tip, smooth along one edge, jagged along the other, black, heavy, found buried in the mud weeks after the cave-in. Eli had never told anyone he kept it, or how he knew it was Monarch's. During a keynote speech in his final year of graduate school, Eli paused midway through describing a remote habitat conservation project in the eastern ridges. He reached into his coat, fingers curling around the horn. He looked at the crowd, dozens of young students, bright-eyed and eager. And for a brief second, the fog outside the valley filled his vision. He smiled gently. "There's a lesson I learned once," he said, voice calm but firm. "Some guardians don't wear badges. They wear scars and walk through fog,